At my son's funeral, my brother stood beside me with his head bowed, as if our grief was shared. He gripped my shoulder, just like he used to when we were kids, to show me the world wasn't falling apart. And I believed him. 7 days later, I saw him again. Not in mourning, not in tears, but in my house, at my table, with my wife. She was laughing. He was holding her hand. I didn't walk in. I just stood at the window, and I realized betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it grows inside the family, and it blooms where you once watered trust. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Ronald Mason. I was 74 years old the morning I put on the black suit. I hadn't worn it in years, not since my sister's memorial service, and even then it had felt tight around the neck, stiff at the elbows. It hung in my closet like a silent judge, untouched, waiting to remind me of everything I never wanted to attend. I stood in the bedroom, staring at it for a long time. It had been dry cleaned long ago and sealed in a clear plastic bag. The hanger had left its shape in the shoulders. I took it out slowly, almost reverently, like lifting the lid off something sacred. I laid it on the bed. Evelyn was downstairs, probably ironing the shirt I always wore for church. She hadn't spoken much since the call came in. The call. I could still hear the officer's voice, too calm for what he was saying. Something about a traffic stop, a confrontation, shots fired. My son, Michael, had been in the wrong place. Or maybe it had been the right place, but the wrong time. The words didn't matter. Only the silence after them did. That silence had stretched across our home like fog that refused to lift. I sat on the edge of the bed and reached down to polish my shoes. Old leather, cracked near the sole. The kind that squeaked when you walked across polished floors. I remembered buying them when Michael graduated high school. I told him back then that good shoes mattered, that people noticed when a man cared about details. I wasn't sure he ever agreed with me, but he used to nod anyway. I liked that he nodded. The mirror in front of me showed an old man I barely recognized. Pale cheeks, sagging eyes, silver stubble under a chin that once looked sharp in photographs. I didn't shave that morning. Somehow it didn't feel necessary. Death doesn't care about smooth skin. It doesn't care about cologne or cold-blooded rituals. It just waits. Michael's room still smelled like soap and old textbooks. I had walked in the night before and stood there, not touching anything. His shoes were lined up by the wall, a habit from his days in the army. He always kept things neat, structured, even after he came back home. After the discharge, he said nothing felt normal anymore unless he made it that way. Now the room looked paused, like he might walk back in and ask if dinner was ready. But he wouldn't. Downstairs, Evelyn called my name once. I didn't answer. I just picked up the suit, pulled the shirt on, and tried to remember how to tie a necktie. My hands shook. Not from age, I was still strong, but from something deeper. A tremor that started in my ribs and wouldn't stop. I sat again and gave up on the tie. I would button the top and pretend that was enough. Outside, the sky was gray. Not in a poetic way, just heavy and blunt. The kind of weather that makes your jacket damp before you realize it's raining. I stepped onto the porch and saw the funeral home car pull into the driveway. It was long and black, with chrome that had been polished to the point of insult. The driver got out and opened the back. I couldn't see the casket from where I stood, but I felt its presence. My knees stiffened. Evelyn appeared beside me with her scarf already around her shoulders. She didn't look at me, just opened the door, stepped out, and waited by the car. I followed. Step by step, like I was walking underwater. I got in without thinking and stared straight ahead. The driver asked if we were ready. I nodded, though the word didn't feel right in my throat. Ready, Ready for what? To place your child in the ground? There's no such thing. The church was only a few miles from our house. We passed the old gas station where Michael once worked during college, the diner he used to take girls to when he thought we weren't paying attention, the baseball field where he hit his first home run. Every place that held his shadow now stared at us with hollow windows and overgrown weeds. When we pulled up, the parking lot was already lined with familiar cars, a few neighbors, friends from high school, some of his old unit, I guessed, judging by their silence and the stiffness of their postures. I stepped out and adjusted the lapel of my jacket. The suit didn't fit quite right. My body had shifted in all the wrong ways over the years, softened in the places that used to be firm. I walked toward the chapel slowly. I could feel eyes on me, soft condolences wrapped in glances. No one said anything. They didn't need to. Inside, the casket was closed. That had been Evelyn's choice. I wasn't sure I agreed. I had wanted one last look, but she said she couldn't bear to see him that way. I respected her decision, but my hand still itched to touch his forehead one more time, to whisper something, anything, into ears that could no longer hear. We sat in the front pew. The organ played something old and slow, and the pastor stood behind the podium with a paper in his hand. I didn't hear much of what he said, just fragments, words like service, honor, family, loss, words that felt hollow without Michael in the room. Then someone stood beside me, a hand on my shoulder, firm, warm, too familiar. I turned. It was my brother, David. He looked like me, only more confident. His eyes were red, but his tie was perfect. He gave me a nod, the same one he gave me when we were kids sneaking out of our bedroom. He stood beside me the entire service, like a pillar that refused to crumble. And I let him, because in that moment, I needed something to hold me up. I didn't know what it would cost me. I didn't know that the same man who stood beside me while I buried my son would soon stand somewhere else, beside the only other person I had left. But that day, in my black suit, I allowed myself to believe we were still brothers. I allowed myself to grieve with a hand on my shoulder, not knowing it was already pulling away. The days after the funeral passed like smoke. Nothing held its shape for long. Time didn't move forward or backward. It just circled me in a slow, suffocating loop. I found myself waking up at strange hours, unable to tell if it was morning or evening. The house seemed to breathe differently. The walls, once full of warm echoes, now only sighed when the wind passed through the cracks in the window frames. I stopped using the bedroom. Something about the bed felt wrong. The indent on Michael's side was still there from the last time he had come home and crashed after a long shift. I used to joke that he never slept straight, always diagonal, like he wanted to occupy as much of the world as possible. Now the dent looked like a wound in the mattress, and I couldn't bear to lie beside it. I moved into the guest room and didn't explain myself. Evelyn didn't ask. She stayed in her own silence, wrapping it around her like a blanket too heavy to shake off. The first Sunday after we buried him, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at a cup of coffee I hadn't made. It was there, steaming faintly, placed neatly beside the newspaper I no longer read. Evelyn had made it. She didn't say anything, just placed it down and walked out into the yard. I watched her from the window. She stood by the edge of the garden, looking at nothing in particular, arms crossed. She didn't cry. I hadn't seen her cry once. It scared me more than if she had fallen apart completely. I drank the coffee cold, hours later. It tasted like cardboard, but I drank it anyway, because it was the first thing that felt intentional in days. The rest of life had become a series of motions. Eating, dressing, showering. All of it felt borrowed from someone else's routine. I tried going into Michael's room again. The door creaked like it hadn't in years. The posters on the wall had faded along the edges, and the bookshelf still held a stack of comic books he'd sworn he'd never part with. I sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the ceiling. It still had the glow-in-the-dark stars we'd put up when he was 12. Most of them had peeled away, but a few clung stubbornly to the plaster. I turned off the light for a moment. The faint green glow was barely visible, like a dying constellation no one would ever name. I opened his desk drawer and found a notebook. The pages were filled with training schedules, quick sketches, names I didn't recognize. One page had a scribble that looked like a list of things he wanted to do. Fix the porch light. Take Dad to the old fishing spot. Clean out the truck. Call Julie. I didn't know who Julie was. Maybe someone from his unit. Maybe a woman he never had the time to introduce to us. I ran my hand over the page, letting the paper scrape against my skin. I didn't take the notebook. I just closed the drawer and left it as it was. That afternoon, I went out to the shed behind the house. It smelled like oil and rust. The rake was still propped in the corner where I'd last seen Michael leave it. I picked it up and began dragging it across the yard, more out of habit than need. Leaves had already begun falling, crisp and red, despite it being early in the season. I raked them into uneven piles and watched the wind undo my work again and again. The fence near the back had a loose board. Michael had promised to fix it months ago. I walked over and touched it. The wood was soft, frayed around the nails. I pulled one loose and let it drop into the dirt. I thought about getting my tools, but I didn't move. I just stood there, my hand on the broken plank, staring into the neighbor's empty yard. Inside the house, Evelyn moved quietly. She barely touched the piano anymore. It had once filled the afternoons with old hymns and songs from her childhood, melodies she'd taught Michael when he was small. Now the keys were silent, and dust had begun collecting in the seams. I ran a finger across the top of it one evening and looked at the gray trail I left behind. Ash in the cracks. That's how it felt. The whole house was full of it, memories crumbling into dust, too fine to sweep away. At night, I sat in the dark and listened to the refrigerator hum. I could tell the time by its cycle. Every hour, a buzz. Every few hours, a rattle in the pipes. I memorized the sound of silence between those moments. It wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. The kind of waiting that feels like it might never end. I found myself going back to the park where I used to work. Not during the day. Late, after the sun had gone. I'd sit on the bench near the duck pond, the one we'd built when I was still in charge of the maintenance crew. It was crooked now, one leg sinking into the soft earth. No one had fixed it. I liked it that way. It felt honest, broken, but still standing. Sometimes I'd imagine Michael walking up the path, boots scuffing the gravel, hands in his pockets, that half smile he always wore when he had something to confess. He'd sit beside me and say, "You didn't think I'd leave you alone, did you?" But the path always stayed empty. The trees creaked in the wind, and the pond reflected nothing but darkness. I didn't tell Evelyn where I went. We barely spoke at all. When we did, it was about groceries, appointments, the mail, necessary things, functional words. Love had gone underground, buried beneath the weight of grief too large for two people to carry without splitting apart. One morning, I noticed her sitting in Michael's room. The door was half open, and she didn't see me. She was holding a sweater of his, pressing it to her face, breathing in whatever scent still lingered. She sat perfectly still, like a statue carved out of longing. I walked away before she noticed me. I didn't want to interrupt whatever moment she had managed to salvage from the ruins. In those early weeks, we became strangers in our own home. Not because we stopped loving each other, but because we didn't know how to be around the shape of grief the other carried. Hers was silent and cold. Mine was loud on the inside and quiet everywhere else. We passed each other like ghosts. Two people haunted by the same absence but unable to say its name. The walls held everything. Every photograph, every scrape on the paint, every dent in the floorboard. I didn't move anything. I let the dust settle. I let the silence grow. It felt like the only honest thing left. There was no fixing this. No way to smooth out the cracks or paint over the pain. Grief, I learned, isn't a fire that burns itself out. It's ash that seeps into every corner. And once it's in, it stays. It fills the air, the breath, the space between words. It becomes part of the house, part of the skin. And no matter how hard you try, you can never scrub it all away. I noticed the picture frame was tilted on the hallway wall. It wasn't the sort of thing most people would see, but I'd hung it myself years ago, and I knew its angles. The glass pane inside had a hairline crack that ran diagonally across the bottom left corner, barely visible, but I knew it was there. I had meant to replace it, but never did. Now that small fracture drew my eye every time I passed. It looked deeper somehow, like it had grown teeth. That frame held a photo of the three of us, me, Evelyn, and Michael, taken on the back porch one summer when the flowers were in full bloom and no one had reason to look away from the camera. We had our arms around each other. My hand rested on Michael's shoulder, his eyes squinting from the sun. Evelyn had leaned her head gently against mine. It had once been a comfort to see. Now it felt like a memory I wasn't supposed to look at anymore. The glass caught the morning light in a way that distorted our faces, as though time was beginning to blur what once felt solid. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at that crack. It reminded me of a fault line, something beneath the surface shifting quietly until one day, everything collapses. I touched the edge of the frame with my thumb. The dust clung to my skin. I didn't wipe it off. I left it there like a small act of protest against whatever was happening in the house. Evelyn had started humming again. I could hear it through the walls, low and almost tuneless. She never used to hum when she was alone. That was something she did while cooking or folding laundry when Michael was around. The melody drifted through the rooms like steam, warm and strange. It stopped the moment I stepped into the same space, as if it was not meant for me to hear. The mail had started coming addressed to someone else, not in name, but in tone. The magazines she subscribed to were different, sleek covers with titles I didn't recognize. Self-improvement, travel destinations, new wines. We'd never been wine people. The corkscrew in our kitchen drawer had dust on it when I opened it one evening to find a spoon. Now it was gone. I found the corkscrew later on the counter, freshly used, beside a half-empty bottle I hadn't opened. The glasses in the sink were unfamiliar, thinner, taller, like something bought for someone else. One still had the outline of a lip print on the rim. Not Evelyn's shade, a softer tone, not the bright berry she wore at Michael's graduation. It was a detail no one else would notice. But I did. Sometimes I thought I heard another voice in the house. Not a ghost. Not Michael. A living voice. A male one. I could never catch it clearly. Only fragments, like the tail end of a conversation just as you enter the room. I would stop in the hallway and wait, ears tilted, heart taut, breath held in my throat. Silence would follow, the kind that comes too quickly to be natural. I began to make excuses to stay outside longer. I raked the leaves even when there were none. I trimmed hedges that didn't need it. I repainted the mailbox. I tried to turn the porch into a place I could claim, with my chair, my books, my coffee. But the house loomed behind me, pressing at my back. It felt like an uninvited guest standing in my shadow. The night I found the second toothbrush was when something broke inside me, quietly. I had gone into the upstairs bathroom, the one we rarely used. It was Michael's old one. I needed something. Aspirin maybe, I don't remember now. I opened the cabinet, and there it was. A toothbrush I didn't recognize. Black handle. New. Next to hers. I stared at it for several seconds before I even registered what it meant. It could have belonged to a guest, I told myself. Maybe Evelyn had bought it just in case. But I knew her habits. She hated clutter. She never kept extra anything. I closed the cabinet and didn't mention it. Instead, I took the aspirin and returned to the guest room. I lay in bed with my eyes open, counting the shadows that moved along the ceiling as the headlights of passing cars flashed through the blinds. At some point, I heard the stairs creak, not in the way they creaked under Evelyn's careful weight. These were heavier steps, slower. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I let the moment pass like a storm I hoped would go around me. The next morning, there were 2 mugs in the sink again. One was hers. The other had initials etched into the side. Not mine. I stared at them, then washed them both. My hands moved on their own, but my mind was somewhere else, looping back to the picture frame and its crack. How it had been small once. How it had grown. Later that day, I walked into the living room and noticed the furniture had shifted. The armchair angled slightly more toward the window. The throw blanket folded differently. A pillow that used to rest on the couch now sat on the floor, as if someone had sat there, pressed against it. I looked at those things and felt as though the house was trying to speak to me in gestures, in clues. It didn't need words. The evidence was everywhere. I saw my brother's cologne bottle on the back shelf of the bathroom sink the following week. Same brand he always used. The cap was loose. The smell was faint, but unmistakable. I didn't touch it. I didn't even move it. I left it there like a burning flag in a field I once called home. The worst part wasn't the discovery. It was the normalization. The way the silence began to shape itself around new habits. The way Evelyn's eyes met mine for shorter and shorter spans of time. The way her phone always faced down on the table. The way laughter returned to the house, but not in rooms I was in. I walked past the hallway one morning and saw her standing by that photo frame, the one with the crack. She adjusted it gently, running her fingers along the edge, like smoothing out a memory. Then she walked away. I stood there after she was gone and looked again at our frozen smiles behind that fractured glass. I saw it differently then, not as a moment to be cherished, but as a mirror, shattered, trying to hold the shape of something that no longer existed. I didn't fix the frame. I left it tilted. I wanted the crack to grow. I wanted the photograph to decay in its own quiet way, because something inside me had already done the same. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, persistently, like ash drifting into corners, like betrayal whispered through thin walls. I went outside and sat on the porch again, letting the sun warm my face. I didn't bring a book. I didn't bring coffee. I just sat there, listening to the glass tremble in the hallway as the wind shifted ever so slightly through the frame. I returned to our bedroom one night out of habit. I told myself it was just for sleep, nothing more. The guest room had grown cold, and the mattress was too firm. My back ached more each morning, and I was tired of pretending I didn't care. I stepped into the bedroom like a visitor. The air inside felt untouched, as if the room itself had been holding its breath. The curtains were drawn shut, but I could see the outline of Evelyn under the blanket. She was turned to the wall, still not asleep but distant. I said nothing. I slipped into bed fully clothed and pulled the blanket just high enough to cover my chest. The space between us might as well have been a river, a canyon, something vast and ancient. There was a time when our bodies found each other in the dark without thinking. Now even our breathing felt mismatched. Hers was shallow and quick, mine long, held back, restrained like a man trying not to cry in church. The mattress creaked beneath my weight. The springs had softened in the middle from years of use. I could feel the dip between us, the way our bodies had carved two hollows that once reached toward one another. Now, They recoiled. I lay on my back, eyes open to the ceiling. The ceiling fan spun slowly above us, pushing air that smelled faintly of lavender, and something else, something sharper, like cologne that didn't belong to me. I tried to convince myself it was left over from a store sample, or maybe something Evelyn had sprayed out of curiosity. But the scent lingered too long, clung too specifically to the side of the bed I no longer occupied. There were new indentations in the carpet near the closet, as if someone had stood there often, repeatedly, feet planted with confidence. I could picture them, shoes polished, expensive, a watch glinting in the lamplight. The kind of presence that takes comfort in silence, because it has nothing to hide from. The pillow I used to sleep on was still there, but it had been fluffed. Not like I used to fluff it. It had a different shape, a higher swell, like it had supported someone else's head recently. I didn't touch it. I let it sit there, like a marker. The blanket was folded at the foot of the bed in a style I never used. Evelyn had always been neat, but now there was a precision to her folding I didn't recognize, as if she had learned it somewhere new. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of her shifting. She moved quietly, deliberately, as if not wanting to disturb someone else, not me. I kept my eyes closed and let her think I was asleep. She rose from the bed and walked to the bathroom. The light clicked on, then off again moments later. I heard the whisper of water, a cabinet creaking open, and then the silence of someone staring at themselves in the mirror longer than necessary. When she returned, she didn't climb into bed right away. She stood near the window, the moonlight outlining her shape through the fabric of her robe. Her hands were at her sides, limp. She looked out for a long time. I listened to the clock tick, each second a knock in my chest. Then, without a word, she climbed back into bed and turned away again. I stared into the darkness, but all I could see was the wall, the invisible one between us. It had started as something soft, fatigue, grief, unspoken tension, but now it had hardened. It wasn't just distance, it was division. She was still my wife. We still shared meals, a roof, memories. But in that bed, we were no longer husband and wife. We were two occupants of a history that had run out of present tense. The next morning, I rose before her. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my slippers. I used to keep them tucked neatly under the nightstand. Now they were askew, one on its side, the other half buried beneath the curtain. I didn't fix them. I put them on the way they were, and walked out without looking back. In the kitchen, the coffee was already brewed. She had set out 2 cups. I poured myself one and sat in the chair by the window. The chair creaked the way it always had. I found a strange comfort in that. The creaking hadn't changed, even if everything else had. The coffee tasted burnt, slightly too bitter. She had never used to let it sit on the burner that long. She entered a few minutes later, took her cup, and sat across from me. We didn't speak. The sound of the spoon stirring sugar was the only conversation. She didn't look at me. She gazed out the window like I wasn't there. I did the same. I focused on the neighbor's mailbox. The red flag was up. Something small and ordinary, but it grounded me. I sipped slowly, listening for her breathing. Still shallow, still apart. Later that day, I found myself in the garage, searching for something to fix. I opened boxes, ran my hands over old tools. I found a rusted wrench I hadn't used in years and spent 20 minutes cleaning it, even though I had no plan to use it. I needed something in my hands, something solid, simple, loyal. The wrench had only ever been what it was meant to be. That night, I returned again to our bed, not out of hope, but out of exhaustion. My body knew the shape of that mattress. My bones remembered where to rest. I lay down and stared at the ceiling once more. Evelyn was already turned to the wall, her breathing steady. I wondered what she thought about at night, if anything. or if she simply waited for sleep like a visitor who never truly felt at home. The wall between us didn't grow in height or width. It grew in silence. Every word unspoken added a brick. Every sideways glance added mortar. Every small decision to withhold affection hardened its surface. We weren't fighting. We weren't angry. We had just built something neither of us wanted to admit was real. And now it stood firm between us, even as we lay inches apart. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time I had reached for her. Not by accident, not in passing. A real reaching, a real wanting. I couldn't. And maybe that was the clearest sign of all. Not the toothbrush, not the wine glasses, not the cologne or the voices or the laughter I wasn't allowed to hear, but the absence of that memory. The space between our bodies was no longer just space. It was decision. It was resignation. It was the quiet knowledge that love can erode not only through hatred, but through neglect, through routine, through the heavy weight of all that is never said. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to the fan, the ticking clock, and the soft breath of the woman I used to know. I found the cup again in the back of the cabinet, behind the matching set Evelyn had bought a few years ago from some catalog she used to read with her morning toast. It was chipped where the handle had broken off, the crack dull and smooth from years of washing. I remembered the day it slipped from my hands, maybe a decade ago, and how the handle hit the floor and rolled under the fridge. I had crouched there, fingertips reaching under the metal, but I never found it. Evelyn said to throw the cup away. I never did. There was something comforting about its imperfection. I reached for it now without thinking, even though the newer ones were cleaner, brighter, more symmetrical. My hand wrapped around the warm ceramic, the same way it always had, carefully, with a small tilt so the heat wouldn't burn my knuckles. It had become a ritual, using this one, a quiet defiance, something broken, still in service, something familiar. I sat by the window and watched the morning light stretch across the countertop, long and pale. The backyard was covered in frost, the edges of the leaves catching sunlight like sugar. I didn't move. I didn't sip. I just held the cup and let the warmth bleed into my fingers. Evelyn was upstairs. I could hear her steps above me, soft and deliberate. She had become quiet in her movements lately. Everything she did was smooth, calculated. There was no longer any casualness in her body. She had grown into someone I no longer understood, like a language I once spoke fluently, but hadn't used in years. The sound of her pacing above reminded me of footsteps from another life. That morning, I noticed something else. A small item on the entry table by the door. A key fob. Not ours. Black plastic with a silver edge. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. No label. No tag. Just sleek and unfamiliar. I placed it back exactly where it had been. I didn't want her to know I had touched it. The day unfolded slowly. I tried to read the paper, but the words were empty. I opened the garage and stared at my workbench. I picked up tools and put them down again. Everything felt unfinished. The shelves were organized the way I liked them, but I noticed gaps. A few items were missing. Maybe I had lent them out. Maybe they were buried beneath something else. I stood there for a long time with a wrench in my hand, unsure whether I had meant to fix something or just needed to feel useful. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn was in the kitchen, humming again. The tune meant nothing. She hummed in short, uncertain phrases, like someone trying to recall a song they hadn't heard in years. I watched her from the doorway. Her back was straight, her shoulders relaxed. She moved like someone who wasn't waiting for anything anymore. She made 2 cups of coffee and placed them on the counter. One was in a clean blue mug from the new set. The other was in a plain white one. Neither were for me. I didn't ask who the second cup was for. She walked away before I could speak, leaving the cups behind as if they would explain themselves. Later, I stood in the kitchen and stared at them. The coffee in both had cooled. The one in the white mug had a faint lipstick mark along the rim, delicate and unfamiliar. Evelyn never wore that shade. I touched the ceramic, then pulled my hand back as if I'd been caught doing something wrong. I went outside and stood on the porch, holding my own chipped cup like a relic. The cold air pressed into my skin, but I didn't go back inside. I listened to the wind shift the leaves, to the quiet engine of a car passing in the distance. I looked down at the cup and studied the missing handle. There was a smooth groove where my thumb rested naturally, a habit born of necessity. The cup had adapted. I had adapted, but there was no satisfaction in it. Evelyn had gone out before sunset. I watched from the window as she stepped into a silver sedan I didn't recognize. It wasn't David's, and it wasn't hers. She didn't look back. The car moved slowly, deliberately, and disappeared down the road. I stood there until the sky turned dark and the window no longer reflected the outside, but only me. I cleaned the kitchen while she was gone, not because it needed it, not because she asked. I just needed the sound of something, the running water, the scrape of a sponge against a dish, the click of a cabinet door. I wiped down the counter, then hesitated when I reached the cup she had left behind, the one with the lipstick stain. I stared at it. I didn't wash it. I just moved it slightly out of sight behind the kettle. When she returned, I was already in bed. I heard the keys, the creak of the front door, the soft thump of her shoes on the mat. She didn't check on me, didn't stop at the bedroom. I heard her settle somewhere in the house, maybe the den, maybe the kitchen. I lay in the dark and tried to imagine her expression. Was she calm, guilty, relieved? The house no longer felt like ours. It felt like a space we shared out of convenience, like two travelers stranded in the same airport lounge, waiting for flights that would never be announced. The furniture was familiar, the walls unchanged, but everything in between had shifted. I kept the handleless cup on my nightstand that night. I liked the weight of it, the stubbornness. I liked that it had survived breakage. But I also hated it, because no matter how long I'd used it, no matter how many times I'd washed it or cupped it in my palms for warmth, it would never be whole again. I dreamed of a porch swing and Michael's laughter. I dreamed of a time when the walls of the house didn't listen, when the objects in the kitchen didn't speak louder than the people who used them. When morning came, the cup was still there, cold, waiting, just like me. I began to notice the absence before I understood what it meant. It crept into the corners of the house and settled like a fog. The warmth that used to greet me at the door had thinned into something weightless. I would walk from room to room and feel as if I were passing through an empty shell. Everything remained in its place. Curtains drawn, cushions neatly stacked, lamps turned off just right. But something fundamental had vanished. It was the scent. Every home has one, even if you live in it long enough to forget it's there. Ours had always carried a soft trace of old cedar and Evelyn's laundry soap, a powdery smell that lingered on her sweaters, sometimes the faint bite of onions when she cooked, or lemon oil from when I polished the banister. They weren't strong scents, but they were ours. The last few weeks, though, the air had turned blank. I would walk into the bedroom and inhale without thinking and find nothing. Just stillness. I didn't say anything. I wasn't even sure I could explain it, but I kept trying to catch it again, the way you try to recall a dream hours after waking. I opened drawers. I held clothes to my face. I sniffed the pillows and the curtains and even the pages of her cookbooks. Everything smelled like dust. I started lighting matches, not for any purpose, just to burn something. The sulfur was harsh, almost metallic, but at least it was something. I'd let it linger in the air for a few seconds before waving it out, watching the gray smoke rise and twist, dissolve against the ceiling. One morning, I opened the refrigerator and stared at the shelves. It was full, but nothing looked familiar. Strange brands, unlabeled containers, a jar of pickled something I couldn't name. I reached for the milk, but the expiration date was 2 days old. I set it back and closed the door, forgetting why I had opened it in the first place. I wandered the house like a tenant, waiting for the landlord to show up. I stopped opening the newspaper. I didn't care what was happening outside. I started to forget what day it was. The calendar in the hallway still read the same page from the month before. I hadn't turned it. I hadn't cared to. The front porch became my anchor. I would sit there with my chipped cup, listening to the neighbors' wind chimes clink in the morning breeze. I never liked them before. They were too shrill, too eager. But now I welcomed the sound, because it was proof that the world outside still moved, even if mine had stalled. Evelyn passed me on her way to the mailbox one afternoon. She didn't say anything. Her perfume used to trail behind her like a soft ribbon. Now she smelled like nothing, not even skin. It was as if she had erased herself, molecule by molecule, and I hadn't noticed until now. I watched her open a letter, skim it, then slip it into her coat pocket without a pause. I wondered who had written it. I wondered why she didn't bring it inside. She stood on the driveway for a few more seconds, reading something on her phone, then turned and walked back into the house without looking in my direction. That night, I opened the drawer of her vanity. It used to overflow with things: lipsticks, brushes, tiny vials of oils and balms. Now it was almost bare. 2 lipsticks, both capped. 1 hairbrush, a bottle of hand cream I hadn't seen before, with a label in French. I twisted it open. It had no smell. I started opening windows in the early mornings, just to let in the wind. It didn't bring anything with it. Not the scent of dew, not of trees, not even the metallic whiff of car exhaust from the street below. It was as if the whole world had gone neutral. I stood in the kitchen one morning with the window open, letting the breeze pass through my shirt like I was transparent. I pulled out an old box from the attic that afternoon. It was filled with things I'd forgotten we kept: letters, cards from anniversaries, an old scarf of Evelyn's. I pressed it to my nose and waited. Nothing. Just fibers. Just fabric. No trace of the woman who used to laugh when I wore it around my head like a turban to make her smile. I started to believe the house itself had stopped remembering. That maybe in grief, even the walls shed their memory. That maybe scent was tied to love, and when love drained out, the air went with it. I took to walking around at night, through the darkened halls. I touched furniture I hadn't touched in years: the back of the old recliner, the guest room dresser, the photo frame in the hallway, the one with the faint crack in the glass. I held my breath each time, waiting for something to rise up, some residual fingerprint of the past. But nothing did. Sometimes I thought of Michael's cologne. It used to fill the hallway after he passed through it, that sharp, woodsy scent that seemed too mature for him when he was younger. I kept one of his jackets in the coat closet. One night I took it out and held it close. Nothing. I began cleaning compulsively, not because anything was dirty, but because I needed to touch the surfaces. I scrubbed until my knuckles hurt. I polished the wooden railing, wiped down the countertops, mopped the floor even though it was spotless. Still, the house remained scentless, a museum of neutral tones. The only thing that still had a smell was the soil outside. When I raked the garden, I would kneel and press my hands into the earth. That old musty scent would rise and fill my nose. I lingered there longer each time, not planting anything, not tending to anything, just breathing in the proof that something still held life. Evelyn began staying out later. She would leave without saying where she was going and return with no trace of the world on her. No wind in her hair. No fragrance of restaurant food or someone else's car interior. She would glide through the front door like a ghost and disappear down the hallway. I began to think that maybe I was the only one who noticed, that maybe the world still had scent, and I had simply lost my ability to perceive it, that something inside me had dulled so deeply that nothing could penetrate it anymore. I didn't ask her. I didn't see the point. If I asked, she might lie. Or worse, she might tell the truth. And then the silence would be complete. One morning, I woke to find her already gone. Her side of the bed was made. Tightly. Neatly. I sat up and stared at the ceiling. The fan rotated above me, stirring the same unscented air around the room. I got up, walked to the window, and opened it wide. I stood there for a long time, waiting for something to come in. Something sharp, or sweet, or bitter. Anything. But all that came was wind. Quiet and clean. Cold against my skin. The kind of air that carries no message. The kind that leaves you exactly as it found you. I found myself tracing lines in the dust without meaning to. It started with my fingertip resting on the top of the hallway table, moving slowly through the fine gray layer that had settled over the wood. I hadn't dusted it in weeks, maybe months. My hand moved in a small arc, then another, forming a shape I didn't recognize until I stepped back. It looked like a tree, or maybe a vein, something that branched, spread, reached out, and never closed. I wiped it away a second later. The dust wasn't from neglect. It was a kind of quiet resistance. I had stopped wiping the surfaces because I wanted them to tell the truth, to collect time, to show that the house still breathed, even if unevenly. Evelyn continued cleaning the places that were visible: kitchen counters, bathroom tiles, mirrors. But the spaces in between, the bookshelf tops, the windowsills, the corners of the steps, those belonged to me now. They gathered their own evidence. I opened the drawer in the entry table and found Michael's baseball glove. I hadn't seen it since he moved out after college. It still held the shape of his hand. The leather was stiff, the laces frayed. There was dust inside the pocket, but it felt wrong to clean it. I put it back without closing the drawer all the way. I wanted to remember that it was there. I began to notice how certain things were never quite where I left them. A book I had placed spine up on the couch would be turned face down. A pair of slippers I'd left beside the recliner, now neatly aligned by the hearth. Evelyn said nothing, but her touch had returned to the objects, not to me. That morning, I found a single plate in the sink, still wet around the rim. It had a red lipstick stain on it, not Evelyn's color. The plate was one from the wedding set, the kind she had insisted we use only for holidays. I lifted it carefully, held it to the light, and studied the faint half-moon of her absence. In the living room, I noticed a throw blanket folded differently than I remembered. She had always tucked it into the arm of the couch in a way that showed the pattern. Now it was folded flat, corners squared, as if by a different set of hands. I sat down and let my hand rest on the armrest. I felt a faint indentation where someone else had sat. The afternoon passed like it always did. Slow and full of breath I didn't feel like taking. I made tea, though I didn't want it. I boiled the water, poured it into my cup, the one without a handle, and stood by the sink until the steam stopped rising. The silence was not peaceful. It was precise. It cut clean. Evelyn was in the bedroom, the door closed. I knew she wasn't sleeping. The television murmured behind the wall, a distant sound, too faint to follow. She had started turning the volume low, like she wanted to hear something else beneath it. I went into Michael's room again. The dust on the dresser was thicker. I wrote his name in it, just the first 3 letters, M-I-C. I didn't know why I stopped. Maybe because it didn't feel right to finish. Maybe because I wasn't ready to let the whole name out into the room again. I rubbed it away with my sleeve. There was a photo still taped to his mirror. Him in his army uniform, grinning too wide. The edges of the photo curled from years of sun. I reached up and straightened it. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, knees apart, hands loose between them, and stared at my reflection. It didn't look like me. It looked like a version of myself that had been left behind somewhere. I didn't touch the glass. I just watched it watch me back. That night, I woke to a light on in the hallway. I got up, feet quiet on the hardwood, and stepped into the corridor. A sliver of light came from the den. I walked toward it slowly, careful not to make the floorboards complain. I stopped at the doorframe and peered in. David was there. My brother. Sitting in the chair I used to read in, legs crossed, reading glasses low on his nose, a glass of something dark in his hand. Evelyn stood near the bookshelf, barefoot, holding a folded blanket. She was laughing, not loudly, not wildly, just that soft, knowing laugh I hadn't heard from her in years. I backed away before they saw me. I moved down the hall like a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. My breath caught somewhere beneath my ribs and refused to settle. I returned to the bedroom, slid under the covers, and stared at the ceiling. My hands were shaking, not from rage, from recognition, that laugh, that posture, that ease. It wasn't sudden. It had been happening in small pieces, like the dust settling across everything I hadn't wanted to see. It wasn't about the lipstick, or the scent, or the realignment of furniture. It was about the softness of forgetting, the quiet erasure of lines once drawn. The next morning, the light through the kitchen window felt sharper than usual. I watched it climb across the counter, revealing fingerprints on the fridge handle that weren't mine. I walked over and placed my hand beside them. My fingers were wider. These were narrower, slender, confident. I opened the pantry and stood there, just staring. The arrangement had changed. The jars were in order, alphabetical. I never did that. Evelyn never did either. But David had always been like that, organized to the point of performance. He used to alphabetize our cassette tapes growing up. I remembered because I always made fun of him for it. He said it made chaos easier to bear. I closed the pantry slowly, then picked up my cup, the handleless one, and poured myself coffee. It was lukewarm, but I drank it anyway. I sat at the table and stared out the window, the dust on the sill catching the morning sun in strands of gold. I reached out and drew a single line through it. Straight. Unbroken. Then I blew on it softly, and the dust lifted for a moment before settling again. The line remained, a fragile reminder that even in neglect, something could still be shaped. Even in silence, something could still be said, even if no one else was listening. The house had mirrors in all the usual places, one in the bathroom above the sink, one in the hallway near the coat rack, a full-length mirror on the back of the bedroom closet door. For years, they had been functional, unnoticed, part of the everyday rhythm of moving through rooms. But lately, I had started to catch things in them. Not figures, not movements, something smaller, a shift in posture, a flicker, a moment where what I saw didn't line up with what I felt. It began on a Wednesday afternoon. I had gone into the bedroom to retrieve a sweater. The wind had picked up outside, and the air had turned sharp. I opened the closet door and saw myself in the full-length mirror. My own face looked tired, in a way I hadn't fully accepted. The lines around my mouth had deepened. My shoulders had rounded. My eyes, those I didn't recognize. I stood there for a long time, not out of vanity, but out of disbelief. I wasn't the man I remembered being. Something had drained from me slowly, in small, polite withdrawals, until I had become this hollow figure with a still-beating heart. I reached for the sweater, and that's when I noticed it. A second shadow in the reflection. I turned, but no one was there. I turned back, and the mirror showed only me again. But I had seen it. Something behind me. A blur near the doorframe. I stayed there, holding my breath, waiting for my eyes to adjust, for reason to return. Nothing. Just the echo of a moment that didn't belong to the present. Later that day, I walked past the bathroom mirror and paused. The lighting was strange, yellowed, dimmer than usual, though the bulb was fine. I leaned in, stared at the lines between my eyebrows, the tired skin beneath my jaw, and in the corner of the frame, just past my shoulder, a flicker again. Not a person, not a shape, a suggestion, like memory forcing its way into the physical. I blinked, stepped back, and ran water into the sink. I splashed my face and looked again. Only me. But the feeling didn't leave. Evelyn had been using the hall mirror more often. I'd find smudges on the glass in the mornings, fingerprints where she'd adjusted her scarf or smoothed her blouse. Once I saw a faint lipstick imprint on the edge of the mirror's wood. A mouth print, soft, deliberate, as if someone had leaned in close, not just to look, but to be seen. I wiped it away before she noticed. I don't know why. It felt too intimate to leave there, like reading someone's diary out in the open. That evening, I found her perfume bottle on the dresser. It was turned slightly toward the mirror, the label facing out, like it had been displayed for someone else. Evelyn never cared about presentation, but now the bottle stood centered, flanked by 2 candles that hadn't been lit in years. I leaned down to smell it. The scent was subtle, distant, like the end of a dream. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked toward the closet mirror again. It was dusk, and the last light of the day filtered in at an angle that made the glass glow. My reflection was still there, but it looked like it had been painted. Flat. Unconvincing. Behind it, a long shape passed by the doorway. I stood up too quickly. My knees ached from the sudden motion. I turned, heart tight in my chest. The hallway was empty. But something had changed. The mirror had a new fingerprint. I hadn't touched it. The mark was fresh, angled, higher than my own reach. I placed my hand next to it. Mine was shorter, broader. This one was narrower, longer, like someone else had been standing where I had, just moments before. Someone I hadn't invited. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator through the floorboards, to the occasional groan of the house as it settled deeper into the earth. At some point, I sat up and looked toward the mirror. I could see the faint shape of the room in it, bathed in pale moonlight. Evelyn was asleep beside me, or at least still. I watched the reflection for what must have been an hour, and then I saw it again. The shadow. Moving, slowly, from one side of the room to the other. Not walking, gliding. A dark smudge against the dim silver of the glass. I turned my head, and the room was still. I turned back to the mirror, and the shadow was gone. The next morning, Evelyn left early. She said nothing as she pulled her coat on and walked out the door. I didn't ask where she was going. I never did anymore. Instead, I walked through the house, checking each mirror as if they were windows to something I had missed. I found nothing, just my own tired image, again and again, but always slightly off. My tie askew when it wasn't, my hair different, my stance unfamiliar. I spent hours sitting in front of the mirror in the den, the one in the old oak frame. I watched myself read, watched myself sip tea. It became a habit, one I didn't talk about. I was looking for proof. Proof of what? I wasn't sure. That I still existed? That the house hadn't swallowed me whole? Then, one afternoon, I caught Evelyn in the bedroom. She was talking softly to someone on the phone. She stood at an angle that faced the mirror. I could see her reflection clearly. Her eyes were soft. Her mouth formed words I couldn't hear. But what struck me was her smile. It wasn't a smile I had seen in years. It belonged to someone else, to a version of her I no longer had access to. The mirror caught it all, not just the shape of her face, but the warmth, the affection, the direction of her attention. I didn't interrupt. I didn't move. I stood just far enough away to remain invisible, even in glass. That evening, I covered the mirror in the hallway with a towel. I couldn't look at it anymore. I didn't want to see what it might show me. I did the same in the bedroom. Evelyn asked nothing. She removed the towel the next morning without comment. We didn't speak about it. Eventually, I stopped glancing at any of them. I let the glass gather dust, let fingerprints remain untouched. I avoided my own reflection like it was someone I had once wronged, because maybe I had. Maybe by staying, by pretending, by not asking questions I already knew the answers to. The mirrors still hung, but I no longer looked into them, because what I had seen, the flicker, the figure, the shadow behind me, it wasn't someone else. It was the version of me who had once believed everything in the reflection was real. And now, even the glass knew better. The kitchen table had 4 chairs, but we had used only 2 for years. One for me, one for Evelyn. Michael had once sat across from us, elbows on the table, cereal bowl in front of him, talking about school or girls or the car that wouldn't start again. After he left for college, the 3rd chair remained untouched. I never moved it. It faced the window, angled just slightly so you could see the maple tree in the yard. A quiet memorial to a time I didn't want to disturb. One morning, I came down the stairs and found a plate sitting in front of that 3rd chair. Not an empty plate, not one that had simply been left behind by accident, but a used one. A few crumbs of toast, a smudge of butter, and a coffee cup beside it, half full, ringed faintly with someone's lips. The chair had been pulled out just a little, as if someone had risen from it only a moment before I walked in. I stood there for a long time, not moving. The light from the window fell across the table, catching the rim of the cup. Evelyn wasn't in the room. The television murmured faintly from the den. I didn't touch the plate. I didn't clean it. I walked past it like it didn't exist and poured myself coffee into the chipped cup I always used. That day, I noticed other small things. The butter dish had been moved to the opposite end of the table. The salt and pepper shakers were side by side, instead of diagonally across from one another the way I preferred. There were 2 spoons in the sink. One had been rinsed and leaned against the edge of the drying rack. The other sat at the bottom of the basin, still streaked with something red. Jam, maybe, or marmalade. I hadn't eaten either in years. I opened the trash can and saw a torn paper napkin with faint lipstick on it. A darker shade than Evelyn ever wore. I didn't say anything. I simply closed the lid and stood there, holding the edge of the counter as if the house had started to sway beneath me. The next morning, it happened again. Another used plate, a different mug. This one was one of the novelty ones from a long-forgotten gift set that Evelyn had once declared too ugly to use. I picked it up, turned it in my hands, studied the cartoon rooster on the side. The inside of the cup was still warm. Whoever had used it hadn't left long before I entered the room. The 3rd chair was no longer a symbol. It was a seat, claimed, occupied, not just in function, but in presence. It had been pulled out farther this time, pushed back hastily, as if someone had stood too quickly. The napkin was still on the table, folded once. There was no ceremony to it, just evidence, casual, comfortable. I began rising earlier, trying to catch the moment. But each time I entered the kitchen, it was the same. The remains, never the visitor. The chair warm, the scent of coffee still lingering in the air. But the person gone. One day, I opened the refrigerator and saw a new container on the top shelf. Something Evelyn never bought. Organic yogurt in a brand neither of us had ever used. I picked it up, checked the date, and placed it back. A different handwriting marked the lid with a black marker. 2s. Evelyn always used blue. I made a mental note and said nothing. It was around this time that Evelyn's wardrobe shifted. She wore colors I didn't recognize, clothes with cleaner lines, more deliberate cuts. She had never been interested in fashion trends, but now she wore things that looked curated. When she walked through the hallway, she moved with a kind of poise I hadn't seen in her for years. Not stiffness, not distance, just certainty. I stopped eating at the table. I took my meals on the porch or in the den. I said I preferred the light there. She didn't protest. Eventually, I stopped pretending to explain myself at all. At night, I would return to the kitchen after the lights had gone out. I'd turn them back on, slowly, quietly, and stand there in the doorway. Sometimes I could see the chair pulled out again, a mug left behind, a trace of sugar spilled near the edge of the table, the kettle on the stove warm to the touch. It was never obvious. There were no voices, no laughter, no shoes by the door that didn't belong. But the guest was real, and he was comfortable, not just tolerated, welcomed. The house made space for him in ways it no longer did for me. One afternoon, I came home from the hardware store and found a man's jacket draped over the back of the kitchen chair. Navy blue, light fabric, the sleeves slightly worn at the cuffs. I stood in the doorway with my keys still in my hand. The jacket didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply hung there, like it belonged. I turned and left the room. I didn't ask Evelyn. I didn't accuse. I didn't touch the jacket. I waited until it was gone again, and when it was, I said nothing. Instead, I started eating lunch in the garage. I cleared off the old workbench and set a placemat on it. I brought down an old camping mug and used that for coffee. I said it was for the peace and quiet. Evelyn nodded when I told her, but she never came out to check. She and the guest had the kitchen now, the table, the chairs, the morning light, the toast, the marmalade, the soft footsteps that I never heard, only felt in the arrangement of things left behind. I dreamed of Michael that week. In the dream, he sat across from me at the table, eating cereal, tapping his spoon against the bowl like he used to do when he was nervous. I asked him if he remembered the chair by the window. He looked at it and said, "It's not mine anymore." I woke up with the weight of those words pressing against my ribs. After that, I stopped going into the kitchen altogether. I made coffee in the garage, ate toast cold, sat on the porch with a blanket across my knees, and watched the world pass by with a detachment I couldn't explain. The guest remained, silent and present, as real as dust in the corners and the creak of the floorboards. One day, I opened the silverware drawer and found a spoon I didn't recognize. Sleek, heavy, engraved initials on the handle. Not mine, not Evelyn's, not Michael's. I closed the drawer again. That evening, I wrote a note to myself on the back of an envelope. It said, "If someone takes your seat, don't ask why. Just find another table." I folded it in half and slipped it into my shirt pocket. It stayed there for days, a secret message to no one, a quiet resignation. The house had made room for a new rhythm, a new presence, and I, who had once been the architect of this space, was now the outsider. Watching the guest drink from my cups, sit in my chair, and leave crumbs across the table I had built with my own hands. I let him, because it was easier than asking when the door had opened and who had unlocked it. I drove out to the lot without telling anyone. The truck started reluctantly, the engine turning over like an old man rising from bed too fast. The roads were empty, the kind of empty you forget exists until you're the only car on it. I took the back way, the long route past the farms and broken fences, through the hills where the trees leaned in like they were whispering to each other about you. The property wasn't far, just 45 minutes from the house, but it felt like another country. We had bought it years ago. Me, Evelyn, and Michael. It was meant to be a weekend project, a cabin someday. Just a slab of land at the edge of a lake where the dirt was soft and the tree line thick enough to drown out the sound of anything man-made. We signed the papers after Michael's second deployment. I told him we'd build it together. He grinned like he believed me. But we never even cleared the weeds. Time kept slipping through our fingers, and eventually, we stopped talking about it. Now the lot sat, as it always had, untouched and overgrown, as if waiting for someone to remember it existed. I parked at the rusted gate, got out, and let the air hit me full in the face. It smelled like rot and pine needles, old water, muck. But there was something clean in it, too. Something honest. The ground didn't lie. I walked through the tall grass, pushing aside brambles with my forearms. The earth was soft underfoot, wet in places. Animal tracks curved through the brush, deer maybe, or something smaller. A fallen tree blocked part of the old path, its bark stripped by time and insects. I stepped over it and made my way to the middle of the lot. I stopped where the soil rose in a gentle hill, the highest point of the property. I stood there, breath visible in the crisp morning air, hands in my pockets, listening to nothing. And then I began to dig. There was no shovel, just my hands. I knelt, pressing my palms into the cold earth, pushing it aside clumsily, carving out a hollow in the ground. The dirt was wet, clumping under my fingernails, staining the cuffs of my jacket. I didn't stop. I dug until my shoulders ached, until my knees went numb from the pressure. I wasn't digging a grave. I wasn't burying anything. I didn't know what I was doing, only that it felt necessary, like breaking ground on something no one else could see. The silence around me was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the steady sound of breath and soil. After an hour, I found the stone. It wasn't large, not enough to be anything remarkable. Just a smooth, flat rock nestled a few inches beneath the surface. I wiped it clean and held it in my palm. It was warm from the friction of digging, though the earth had been cold. I turned it over again and again, as if it might tell me something. But it was just a stone. Weighty, silent, unapologetic. I placed it back in the hole and covered it slowly, pressing the soil down with open hands. I sat beside it for a long time, legs stretched out in front of me, watching the wind finally move the grass. It was strange, how grounded I felt there, with my back against the trunk of a crooked tree and the wet dirt clinging to my skin. I hadn't felt that in weeks, months maybe. The house had become a stage, a place I passed through on quiet feet, trying not to wake something I couldn't name. But this place, this forgotten pocket of land, offered nothing but truth. And that was enough. I thought of Michael then, not the way he looked at the end, worn and weathered by a war I never understood. I thought of him younger, 9 years old, barefoot and running through the backyard, his arms outstretched like wings, shouting something I couldn't hear from the porch. He had believed in everything back then. Dinosaurs still alive in the ocean, buried treasure in the garden, wishes that could ride the tail of a comet. I wondered when he had stopped believing, when I had. Maybe it was the same day. The sky turned gray by mid-afternoon, clouds rolling in low, thick with the threat of rain. I didn't care. I stayed there, letting the cold creep through the denim at my knees, the damp settle into my spine. I didn't want to leave. Not yet. I pulled a notebook from my coat pocket. I had been carrying it for weeks, mostly blank, just a few lines scribbled at the edges. I opened it and wrote down one sentence. This place remembers me. That was all. I didn't sign it. I didn't write the date. I closed the book, placed it in a small crevice at the base of the tree, and covered it with leaves. It wouldn't survive a storm. It wasn't meant to. It just needed to be there, even for a little while. Before I left, I walked down to the water. The lake was still, a flat pane of slate stretching out between the trees. I skipped a stone, the first one I found, not the one from the hill. It skipped twice before sinking, leaving only ripples. The sound of it was enough. On the way back to the truck, I picked a stick off the ground and carved a rough mark into the gatepost. Just a line, a vertical scar in the wood. My mark, meaningless to anyone else. A sign that I had been here, still watching, still thinking. When I returned to the house that evening, the kitchen lights were on. 2 plates on the table, 2 glasses, a soft murmur of voices from the other room. I didn't enter right away. I stood outside, watching through the window, hidden in shadow. There was a man sitting at my table, not in my chair, not yet, but close enough. I placed my hand on the wooden frame of the house, and for a moment, it felt unfamiliar, cold, unwelcoming, indifferent. I dropped my hand, stepped back from the window, and walked toward the garage. There, under the shelf with the paint cans and old fishing rods, I kept the blueprints, rolled tight, sealed with a rubber band, the plans for the cabin we never built. I unrolled them on the workbench, traced the lines with my finger, and imagined what it would be like to finish something for once. The guest had the house, but the land still remembered me, and the stone in the ground had not moved. I drove into town that morning with a folder tucked under my arm. The sky was overcast, the kind of dull gray that flattens everything it touches. The streets looked deserted, even though I knew people were behind the curtains, sipping coffee and watching the world turn. I parked on the street across from the law office, the same one I had passed 100 times before but never entered. The building was quiet. The waiting room smelled like wood polish and stale carpet. The secretary gave me a polite smile, then disappeared down the hallway with my name. I sat alone, my fingers brushing the corner of the folder in my lap. It wasn't heavy, just a few sheets of paper, but it felt like it carried more than its weight. It carried years, choices, silence. When I was called in, I followed the lawyer into his office and sat down across from a desk that looked untouched. Everything in the room was too perfect. Every pen aligned, every surface clear. I placed the folder in front of him and waited as he opened it. He read without speaking, lips pressed together in concentration. I watched his eyes scan the pages, stopping occasionally, lifting his eyebrows, nodding once. He asked a few questions. I answered with short phrases, no embellishments, just facts, dates, names, instructions. His pen moved quickly across the forms, scribbling notes, drawing lines through paragraphs, initialing margins. When he slid the documents back toward me, my name was already printed in neat black letters across the signature lines. I didn't sign immediately. I held the pen for a moment, letting its weight rest between my fingers. Then I wrote my name. Once. Twice. A third time. Each signature looked shakier than the last, like my body was catching up to the gravity of what I was doing. He notarized them, stacked the pages, slid them into a fresh envelope, and placed it in front of me. That envelope stayed sealed on my passenger seat all the way home. I didn't touch it again until I reached the garage. I placed it on the workbench, cleared a space around it, and smoothed it flat with my palm. The paper inside held my voice now, in a way I hadn't spoken aloud in months. I made 2 copies and locked them away. One went under the floorboards in the den, beneath a loose plank I hadn't fixed on purpose. The other I slipped into a frame. It was an old picture frame, the kind meant for diplomas or certificates, with a thick border and a glass pane. I cleaned the glass until I could see my face in it. Then I carefully opened the back and slid the paper inside, just the first page, the one that mattered. The rest I folded away. I closed the frame, pressed the clips down, and leaned it against the back of my bookshelf, behind a row of books that no one ever touched. It wasn't meant to be seen. Not yet. But it was there. A quiet promise. A paper under glass. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving slowly through the house, noting what had shifted since I left. The kitchen towel was folded differently. The couch cushions were rearranged. A wine bottle in the recycling bin bore a label I didn't recognize. Evelyn wasn't home. Her car was gone. I didn't check the time. I went upstairs, into the bedroom, and opened the closet. My clothes hung untouched, but the space beside them had changed. There was a new jacket, a pair of shoes, subtle changes, intentional. I reached out and ran my hand along the fabric. It was smooth, expensive, definitely not mine. Downstairs, I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table. The sunlight hit the window at the perfect angle, throwing long shadows across the floor. I thought about the paper under the glass, the way it sat still, saying everything I had refused to say for months. There was power in ink, finality. It didn't argue. It didn't accuse. It simply existed. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Evelyn was already up, already dressed. She moved through the kitchen with efficiency, placing 2 mugs on the counter, slicing fruit, checking her phone. I watched her from the hallway. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and chose not to react. She poured coffee into both mugs and set one at the third chair, the one across from mine, the one no longer empty. That day I stayed out longer than usual. I walked through the park, the cemetery, the small strip of woods near the church. I found a bench beneath a tree and sat with the envelope in my coat pocket. I could feel it pressing against my ribs every time I breathed. When I returned, there were 2 empty glasses in the sink, a third plate in the dishwasher, music playing softly in the living room, something smooth and polished. Not Evelyn's taste, not mine. I went upstairs and into the guest room, opened the closet, and looked at the space again. Another shirt, another pair of socks, the arrangement too deliberate to be temporary. I returned to the den, moved the books aside, and looked at the frame. The paper under glass stared back at me, unmoved by the noise around it. It didn't ask for anything. It didn't cry. It didn't burn. It just remained. And I found something almost holy in that stillness. I placed it back behind the books, adjusted the row carefully, and stood there in the quiet. That evening, Evelyn asked if I had gone somewhere during the day. I said I had. She didn't press. I didn't offer. After dinner, I stepped outside alone. The wind had picked up. Leaves tumbled across the porch in loose spirals. I sat with my jacket zipped, watching the trees bend under the weight of the weather. The sky looked bruised. The air had the heaviness of coming rain. I thought of Michael again, and how he used to ask me about the stars, if they could hear us, if they remembered us after we were gone. I didn't have answers then. I still didn't. But I knew this. Memory needed a vessel, and sometimes that vessel had to be paper, ink, a signature, a decision made in a room with no audience. The wind knocked something over behind me, a broom or a pot. I didn't flinch. I just sat there and let the moment pass. Inside, the lights were on. Shadows moved across the curtains. Voices, laughter, the sound of plates being cleared. But in the den, behind the bookshelf, under glass, my silence waited. Not for revenge, not for justice, just for its time. I left before sunrise. The sky was still bruised with night, the stars fading reluctantly above the horizon. I didn't pack much. A single duffel bag, a thermos of black coffee, a folded paper I didn't need to read again. I closed the door softly behind me and let the silence settle. I didn't write a note. I didn't lock the door. The truck groaned as it turned over, but it started. I drove without the radio, without music, without distraction. The hum of the engine was enough. The roads were wet from rain the night before, and the headlights stretched out ahead like pale fingers on glass. I passed neighborhoods still asleep, homes glowing faintly with kitchen lights or television screens. I watched them blur by, all that domestic comfort sealed behind closed curtains. It didn't belong to me anymore. The gas station at the edge of town was open, the same one where I used to take Michael for slushies when he was small, before Little League games and after school projects. I didn't stop. I just slowed for the light, let it turn green, and kept going. The further I drove, the more the weight began to shift, slowly, like a knot untangling inside my chest. By the time I reached the property, the first light of day was cracking through the trees. It was golden and brittle, catching in the leaves, reflecting off puddles in the mud. The grass had grown longer since I was last there. Wild things had moved in. Deer, rabbits, tracks of animals I couldn't name. Nature didn't ask permission. It simply reclaimed. I parked beside the rusted gate and stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. The cold met me head-on, but I welcomed it. It was honest, bracing. I breathed in deeply and let it fill me. The clearing in the center of the lot was just as I left it. The soil disturbed, the grass still struggling to grow back. The tree near the center, the one I used to lean against, stood with one broken limb, reaching toward the lake. I sat beneath it and drank the last of my coffee, watching the surface of the water ripple in the wind. It was strange, the calm that took hold. Not peace exactly. Peace implies resolution, and I hadn't come for that. It was something quieter, a detachment maybe, a final loosening of the rope I'd been tying around myself for too many months. Here I could be weightless. I could let go of timelines, obligations, even names. I unpacked the duffel and removed the small metal box. It had once belonged to my father, and before him, his father. I'd found it in the attic years ago, and never touched it since. Now I opened it carefully, removed the old tools inside, and began to dig again. This time not with bare hands, but with intention. The earth gave way easily. It was ready. I carved out a space large enough for what I needed. Not deep, just enough. When it was done, I reached into the duffel and pulled out the envelope. The same one the lawyer had handed me weeks ago. The paper inside wasn't complicated. It didn't carry anger or vengeance. It carried redirection, quiet reallocation. The house, the account, the lot. They all had new futures now. Ones that Evelyn would never be part of. I had stripped them away from the story she thought she was writing. I placed the envelope inside a plastic sleeve, sealed it tightly, and tucked it into a shallow wooden box I had built the night before in the garage. Unmarked, plain. I lowered it into the ground, smoothed the soil over it, and placed a flat stone on top. It wasn't for memory. It was for weight. When I stood again, my knees cracked, my back ached, but I felt taller, straighter, lighter. The rest of the day passed in silence. I walked the perimeter of the land, noting fallen limbs, areas where the soil had softened with water. I found a spot near the lake that might hold a future structure. A small cabin, nothing fancy, just walls and a roof. Enough to keep the cold out, to keep the quiet in. At dusk, I built a fire in the old pit we had dug years ago. The coals from the last fire still lay there, buried under wet leaves. I cleared them, arranged the kindling, and lit the flame. It caught quickly, dancing against the wind, warming the cold air around it. I sat beside it and watched the light flicker on my hands, my knees, the cuffs of my sleeves. I didn't think of Evelyn, not directly, not with pain. Her image passed through me like smoke, thin, untouchable. I thought of all the mornings I had sat in the kitchen across from her, waiting for something to return that never would. The plate set for someone else. The chair no longer mine. The laugh meant for another voice. None of that reached me now. That night, I slept in the truck with the window cracked and the stars above pressing close. I didn't dream. I didn't need to. The land around me held enough memory to keep watch. In the morning, I walked to the edge of the lake and washed my hands in the cold water. The reflection staring back at me wasn't unfamiliar anymore. I had seen him before. I had buried things with him. We understood each other now. I drove back into town just long enough to leave the final envelope at the post office. No return address, just a name on the front, not hers. Someone who would know what to do with it. A step beyond silence. When I returned to the lot, I unpacked the second box of tools and set them in a line on the tailgate. The hammer, the level, the measuring tape. I unfolded the blueprints and spread them across the hood of the truck, weighing down the corners with stones. The first line I drew was tentative, uneven. The second was better. The third held. The day of return had come, not to what was taken or what was lost, but to what could be remade, out here where no one knew where to look, where the ground still remembered the shape of honest labor, where a man could start again, even if no one noticed, especially if no one noticed. The letter arrived 3 days after I left. I had timed it that way. The drive to the post office, the pre-written envelope, the address I memorized years ago. I knew how long it would take to move through the system, how the mailman would leave it in the afternoon, how she would find it resting quietly atop the pile of catalogs and utility bills. There would be no ceremony, just her hands, peeling it open like any other envelope, never suspecting that the world inside it was already gone. I didn't need to be there to hear her voice. I could imagine it. The small intake of breath, the pause, the sudden narrowing of her eyes. She would read each sentence twice, maybe 3 times, hoping to find an error, a loophole, a way back. But there wouldn't be one. The decisions were final. The ink was dry. My name, still mine. The assets, no longer hers. She would search for my signature, and when she found it, she would understand. I didn't answer my phone that week. I turned it off and left it in the glove compartment of the truck. No messages, no calls, no explanations. Silence. It was the only language I had left, and the only one that could not be interrupted. At the cabin site, I cleared a small area for the foundation. I used a string and stakes, measured the perimeter, and began outlining the first row of cinder blocks. My hands worked slow and steady, muscles stiff from age, but still obedient. Every brick I laid was an answer. Every level checked, a punctuation mark. The rhythm of it anchored me in the present, where the air was cold, the earth honest, and no one waited to take anything from me. I imagined David would be the first to lose composure, not because he loved her, not because he cared, but because entitlement does not prepare a man for consequences. He would pace the living room, his voice rising, asking questions Evelyn couldn't answer. He would scan the documents again and again, as if repetition could alter truth. But it wouldn't. The house deed was transferred, the accounts frozen, the land reassigned. His name had never appeared anywhere. I had seen his handwriting once, on a note he left by the sink when I returned home unexpectedly. A casual script, too familiar, resting on a folded napkin. "Back soon," it said. I never confronted him about it. I didn't need to. The napkin was all I required. Paper has always told the truth more plainly than people do. Evelyn might have cried. Or maybe not. Maybe she just sat at the table, tracing the edge of her cup with her finger, trying to map the moment her control slipped through the cracks. I knew her tells, how she rubbed her thumbnail when anxious, how she blinked rapidly when caught unprepared. I knew them all, but I didn't care to see them. That was the point. The silence was the answer. When I had built our life together, I had narrated every step, explained, compromised, apologized, anticipated. When things began to erode, I filled the void with words. But they were wasted. I had argued in my head 1,000 times, drafted speeches, crafted ultimatums. None of them mattered. They would have been discarded like everything else I had given. So I gave silence instead. Final, cold, deliberate. A week passed before I returned to town. I needed supplies: nails, lumber, sealant. I wore an old coat, cap pulled low. I didn't expect to run into anyone, but I did. Mrs. Langston, from the neighborhood. She stood by the checkout counter holding a bag of potting soil, staring at me like I had risen from the dead. She asked how I was doing. I smiled and told her I was keeping busy. That was enough. I didn't ask about Evelyn. I didn't mention the house. She hesitated, then said something about how strange it was, what had happened. I let her speak. She didn't know the half of it. Her voice wavered as she said they thought I might be ill, or worse. I told her I had never been better. Back at the land, I spread gravel for the floor, laid the joists. The sound of each hammer strike echoed through the trees. The forest didn't complain. The wind carried the sound far and wide, as if testifying on my behalf. I wasn't rebuilding a life. I was building something new, something untouched. On the second morning, I lit a fire and made coffee over the coals. The cup was metal, plain, solid. I sipped it slowly, watching the fog rise from the lake. I thought about Evelyn opening the second envelope, the one I had left in the den, behind the shelf, under glass. It wasn't cruel. It was clarity. A copy of the will. A letter. My reasons, written in full. Not for justification, but for the record. Words I never said aloud because the silence did more damage. Words like, enough, and no more, and I remember everything. I included photographs. One of Michael, one of the land, one of the blueprint he and I had drawn on the back of a pizza box when he was 19. His dream, not hers. And now mine again. No annotations, just images. She would understand. The last page had just one line. You can keep the house. It no longer knows my name. I imagined her folding the letter slowly, pressing the creases sharp. I imagined her placing it back under the glass, or maybe throwing it into the fireplace. Either way, it didn't matter. The truth had already landed. And so had I. Each evening, I sat by the fire and let the cold settle around me. I didn't fight it. I let it fill the cracks. I watched the sky turn black, then gray, then blue again. I lost track of the date. The days no longer marked by conflict or silence, but by tasks. A board cut, a nail driven, a wall raised. No voices, no arguments, no explanations. Only the rhythm of my own hands, and the steady silence that followed me wherever I walked. Not an empty silence, a silence earned, a silence paid in full.